we go. Okay, and over to you, Alex.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Alexander Haverkamp. I'm assistant professor for insect physiology here at Wageningen University. And I'm going to talk a bit about how the cricket feels and what the mealworm has to say. So the influence of rearing environments on insect welfare in food, different food and feed systems. And I think in the seminar series, we already had, I think, 3 really great talks, which I think we already gave a very great introduction to insect welfare in general and insect sentience. So today I'm going to try to talk a bit more about insect farming and kind of why we might want to do this or why people might want to do this, and try to bring this a little bit into connection with insect welfare. So I'm going to try to specifically address a little bit of also the different ethical frameworks that people might have when working on insect farming and how this might be different from when we look at insect welfare. And I want to address a little bit how we can address or how we might assess insect welfare or insect well-being in a farming context. And finally, just with one slide, I also want to see how we can maybe combine our welfare measurements with industry practices. And just for your knowledge, so I added this little insect icons just so that you roughly know where we are in this talk. Now, to start with, what is actually insect farming? So I'm mostly focusing now on the insect farming because I think especially in the context of insect welfare, and I think we have seen that through the other seminars as well, this is probably at the moment the point where insect welfare also becomes most relevant. So just as a rough definition, I think whenever we talk about raising and breeding insects in a livestock-like way, then often referred to as mini livestock for the production of food and feed, I think we can talk about insect farming. I'm mostly going to focus now on food and feed, but it's of course important to realize that this is only one aspect of insect farming, and that insects have been farmed for thousands of years for silk, for the production of honey, shellac, or food coloring. But today now mostly about food and feed. It's important to realize, I think, that when we're talking about insect farming for food and feed, we're talking about mainly 2 very different operations. And the one is a bit what you see here, so which happens mostly nowadays in Europe and North America, is where we have an industrial style, largely automated farming system in comparison to small scale farming that we find in many tropical countries, where essentially the insect farming is sort of a side business for smallholder farmers. Another important difference is, of course, also the reason why the insects are being farmed. Right? So whether we consider animals for direct or insects for direct human consumption, or for the production as animal feed, right? This also, of course, greatly determines the rearing system. Now, I think for most people, insects as food and feed is a very novel phenomena. But I just wanted to add here that actually people have been talking about this for quite some time, especially scientists have tried to promote this for mostly sustainability reasons. And I think the first reference is actually this little book, Why Not Eat Insects, by Vincent Holt, who in a kind of a very Victorian mindset of waste not and want not, wanted to encourage its contemporaries to feed its waste to insects and also to eat the insects that are harming our crops. Right? So I think this is the start, but then throughout the ages, there's always been a promotion for eating insects. And especially now in my group and in the Netherlands throughout the 90s and 2000s, there have been various attempts to promote insects. And only nowadays it's coming more to the public awareness. Now, what I think is important to keep in mind when we talk about insect farming, that most researchers, and I think also most entrepreneurs that are working in these areas, really do so for, with sustainability in mind, right? I think everybody is aware, or most people are aware, that we're in the midst of a large biodiversity crisis, and this especially actually concerns insects, right? With up to 70% of insect biomass being lost in the last 30 years. So really some dramatic changes and reforms in the way we produce food have to be made. And this, I think, is very much on the mind of many people that are trying to develop insect farming systems, right? Because especially in if we look at livestock farming, we can see that about 30 or 50%, so in total 50% of our all global emissions are produced by the farming of livestock and fishery. And also about 77% of all arable land is being used for the production of livestock protein, right? And here, insect farming can, of course, be a potential solution. I don't want to say it is a solution, but it can maybe contribute in the way that insects use much less land per gram of protein, and they also produce much less CO2 emissions, right? So here now I quickly have to mention that these calculations are actually always assuming that we use waste products to feed insects. And I'm going to come back to this later, because this is a very important point when we're trying to balance welfare and sustainability goals, right? So these values here are all based on the assumption that there's no greenhouse gas emissions for the insect feed, right? So this point that insects can be reared on waste products is, of course, their major environmental advantage, right? So currently about 6% of all global greenhouse gases are produced through food waste and food loss, right? And here insects can, of course, have a major impact. So I just want to highlight this now from a recent study by et al., where we also contributed. So here, the researchers took China as an example, but this would actually work for, I think, for most countries with a well-developed infrastructure, where they tested a system where all food waste produced by consumers would be used for raising insects that are then used again for food, or direct food by consumers, and where all kind of more low quality organic waste, for example manure, would be used to produce insects that could then be again used to feed livestock, right? And if we would implement such a system, the study actually could show that essentially an agricultural system like the one of China could almost become carbon neutral, and that this even would have large spillover effects on other countries that are main producers of insect feed, of animal feed, for example Brazil. So where insects could really have a very substantial effect on making agricultural systems more sustainable. And it's, of course, not only the direct sustainability advantages, but there's also, of course, the protein that it can be produced, and the protein composition of insects, as they are animals, of course, is actually very similar to that of other livestock. So insects can there be a great source of protein, and they contain actually also often nutrients and vitamins that are not present in plant-based materials, right? So here, insects can also be a healthy alternative to, or like addition to, maybe plant-based products, right? And and then on a more, I think more on a social side, insect farming on a small scale, right? So going away from the industrial feed production can of course also help, especially small scale farmers, to um, to improve their social economic conditions. So this is, for example, an example of small scale farmers, I think in Colombia, that are started on rearing black soldier flies that could be sold as animal feed, utilize, get rid of waste streams, also produce biofertilizers, and thereby overall have a great impact on the social conditions of these farmers. Right? So insect farming can actually also have a very important the social role, especially because these farming systems, they require very little land and very little input to start with. Right? So just to also give an overview quickly of where we currently stand with this insect farming. This is a bit of an older study where they estimated in the US in 2002 that the value of the industry would be about $1 billion US. Now I must say that this is very difficult to validate, and this is still a very volatile business in the way that many companies are still in a startup phase. There's a lot of trial and errors, companies coming and disappearing. So this is very difficult to check, but we're probably around a $1 billion business at the moment, I think, on the US market. Right. But now, just to kind of summarize our first bit here, insect farming certainly can make a huge environmental impact, and it has multiple health benefits, right? As is just essentially just like animal meat, and it can also play an important role in empowering small-scale farmers. Now, you might wonder, okay, why am I telling you all this? Why are we talking about this on a seminar on insect welfare? Because I think the question, of course, arises, are these benefits that we get from insect farming, are they worth risking the suffering of insects in a farming system, right? And this is, of course, not a question that where I can give you an answer to. But I think it is important to realize that it depends very much on the kind of the ethical framework of people working on these systems on how they answer this question. Now, I'm not an ethicist and I'm not a philosopher, and I think there's probably many more people that are much better in addressing this question. But I just want to stress in my very simplified view that people that are working on insect farming from a sustainability point of view probably have a more utilitarian ethical background, where they're trying to maximize the positive outcomes of insect farming, especially in comparison to conventional farming, conventional meat farming, while other people that focus maybe more on the insect welfare or animal welfare in general probably see the animals themselves more as an end to themselves, and more consider what they require for a flourished life. Now, I hope I haven't taken you too far, but I just want to stress this point that very often people working in insect farming and maybe also welfare really engage sometimes in maybe a different mindset of what they consider important, and that if we want to continue a dialogue on implementing insect welfare in insect farming, it's important to realize these different goals that people might have in changing or in designing insect farming systems. Now, with this, I want to switch gears very much, and I want to come back a little bit more to insect welfare, and especially to insect sentience. I think Lars Chitka already gave a great seminar on this last month, so I don't want to repeat this. I think you can find his talk also on the Insect Welfare Research Society website. I just want to briefly summarize that we consider as sentience basically the capacity to experience and to perceive subjectively and to consciously experience things as good or bad. And that this sentience requires some sort of consciousness, so an awareness of internal and external states. And very often, pain is taken as a main criteria, and of course, the very relevant one for welfare. And I just want to point you here at the great work by Jonathan Birch, and who developed 8 criteria here to assess the likelihood of animals having sentience and experiencing pain, and the nice review by Matilda Gibbons, who tested this for different insect groups. Now, also closely related to sentience is, of course, also cognition. And I think an argument that I at least hear a lot is that essentially insects will not be sentient because their brains are simply too small. And this is of course true if we look at purely the number of neurons in comparison to mammals. So a honeybee will have about 1 million neurons, fruit fly about 200,000, and humans, of course, have there many, many more, right? But I think if we look at what insects can do with these numbers of neurons, if we think about the amazing cognitive abilities that they show, if, for example, communication and the honeybee waggle dance, the manipulation of objects, as you can see here or not, right? If the video will play, you could see this bee being able to manipulate this ball in order to get a nectar reward. Very nice work by the group of Lars Chitka. And also the ability, for example, of ants for fungus farming, or monarch butterflies for long distance navigation. So I think we can here safely say that for insects to show these cognitive abilities, the low number of neurons are certainly not an obstacle. And I'm sure that and I think it's likely that the same will also be true for sentience. So that having a large brain might not by no means be a prerequisite for being sentient. And the black soldier fly larvae, even though having a small brain and not perceiving a lot in its environment, might still be able to perceive certain states as good or bad. Now, and I think this is a major dilemma right now for people engaged in insect farming, because simply the ability to assess the ability of insects to be sentient is a very difficult one. And I think people also in insect farming wrestle a lot with this. And although there is no formal legislation yet on insect farming and on welfare in insect farming, there are still, I think, certain efforts currently going on to somehow address this issue. So here's, for example, an example from the Netherlands, where the Council for Animal Affairs, so this is a governmental body that advises the government on legislation, and this animal council actually stated that it cannot be concluded whether insects are sentient, but that there's also no evidence that they're not sentient. So the council advised all insect farmers to treat invertebrates as though they would be sentient, right? So just to point out again, this is no legislation, but there's an advice from this council to treat all to use the precautionary principle and to treat insects as though they would be sentient. Now, but this is of course nice to say, right? We should treat them as though they would be sentient, but a large challenge in this might be actually to figure out what does that mean. So as a farmer, you might have the wish to treat your animals to the highest welfare standards, but especially for insects, it might be challenging to actually determine what that means. So I think the easiest and lowest standard here might probably be the 5 freedoms, or the more modern version than the 5 domains, as Heather Browning already explained in her seminar, which would be the freedom from thirst or hunger, and the freedom from discomfort, from pain, injury, disease, the ability to express normal behaviors, and the freedom from fear and distress. So, which sounds very, very likely or very nice, but of course you still might be faced with the challenge of what that means and how do you assess that for your insect, right? So to do so, I think many farmers nowadays, or people working in insect farming, what they use to measure is essentially the insect growth and survival, and then assuming that an insect, if it grows well and survival is very good, that also means that they were healthy and happy. I will come to that now in a second of how we might use this. At the same time, my group here has also tried to see whether we can use learning performance and brain development as a measurement for how insects perceive certain environments. And we're currently working on seeing whether we can use certain neurotransmitters in combination with behavioral test as an indicator of welfare. And finally, of course, you might also use cognitive tests such as motivational trait or judgment biases, which is of course something that Lars Jitka addressed in his talk last month. So I will not go into detail here on this now today. Now, just to quickly address the growth and survival. So I think for most people in insect farming, this is of course the most logical measurement of insect welfare. And just want to give this quick example here where black soldier fly larvae have been reared on different waste streams. And you can clearly see that these larvae, they grow very well on abattoir and fruit waste here, right? While they grow very poorly on digested sludges, so this is manure that had already been used to produce bioenergy, which is, I would say, clearly an unsuitable substrate for these black soldier fly larvae. And not only growth in this case was impaired, but also was the survival was very low, or was much lower. So here we had a mortality rate of almost 60%, while here we had almost no mortality, right? So I think clearly, without being able here then to make any interference on the mental stage of these animals, we can clearly say that probably the animals on the poor nutrient content were suffering from sort of malnutrition, right? So without any ability to go into the more the cognitive stages of these animals, we can clearly see a violation maybe of the first freedom, right? This I stress this point here a little bit because this actually brings us a little bit into conflict with potential sustainability goals. Because raising these larvae on this very poor substrate would of course be the most sustainable thing to do. So from an aspect where you might want to do the best environmentally, this would in this case mean the worst in terms of the development and survival for these black soldier fly larvae. Right? So here people then might have to actually to balance welfare goals and sustainability goals. Now, in relation to nutrition, I also want to quickly address this example. So this is an image of a typical cricket rearing, I would say, where we have this egg carton shelters. Food is basically being sprinkled. In this case, it's chicken feed across the box. We have an egg laying box here for these crickets and a water feeder. And what researchers did here in this study was that they deprived the crickets of food and then measured the use of their shelter. So crickets naturally like to hide, of course, in these egg cartons, and being out in the open, so exploring an open space, was then seen here as a measurement of welfare. So this, just to come back to this difficulty to actually figure out how can we address how an insect perceives a certain environment. Now, in my group, we're also currently trying to address this, and so this is all that's still a bit unpublished and preliminary data, but we focus then also in crickets mostly on the effect of rearing densities on cricket survival and welfare. And what you see here, for example, in these 3 different rearing densities, that crickets as a kind of a semi-social insect, they do still very well at relatively high densities, but that there's a certain tipping point where then the survival of the crickets dramatically decreases. Right? So here again, just looking at the survival, I would argue that we already have, that we can see just from the survival, of course, a certain environment where the crickets are clearly no longer comfortable. Right? But again, this does not give us any indication of their mental state. So how do we address this mental state? And now I have to go zoom out a little bit because I want to introduce one of our kind of neurobiological parameters. So here you see the head of an insect. In this case, it's actually a bee, not a cricket, but still the brain of the cricket looks somewhat similar. And I just want to draw your attention here to this blue structure, the mushroom body, which is made up of these canyon cells. And this is the learning and memory center in most, the learning and memory center in most insects, or let's say a higher order processing part of the brain. Now, in crickets, new neurons are being added to these mushroom bodies throughout the life of the crickets. Right? So you see that here, these are these cells that are stained here in green. So these are newborn cells that are continuously being added. And these cells are then also incorporated into this higher order processing center or learning center. Right? So in a way, very comparable to the hippocampus, for example, in mice. Now, previous research found that the rate at which these new neurons are being born is very much related to the environment that these crickets are being raised in. Right? So if we rear these crickets in an enriched environment where we give them social contacts and extra olfactory and visual stimulation, we will find more of these newborn cells than in an environment where the crickets were deprived of social contacts and did not have any additional sensory stimuli. Right? So in a way, the proliferation rate here corresponds a little bit to the environmental enrichment that these crickets had. At the same time, other studies also showed that crickets, the males, ritually engage in fights, and that crickets that lose many of these courtship fights will have, so they're called here subordinates, they will have lower rate of newborn neurons than males that win more or have won more of these fights, right? So positive experiences also increases the rate of neurogenesis, so neuron birth, while having negative experiences also decreases the rate of neurogenesis. In addition to this, having more of these neurons will also enable the crickets to do better in simple learning tasks. So these crickets then, they were tested in an arena where they were trained with an odor either to a kind of a trap or a positive hiding place, right? So simple operant conditioning assay, and crickets then with more of these neurons would be able to solve these tasks better. So we were hoping then basically to use, based on this research, we were hoping to use this rate of neuronal proliferation also maybe as a certain indicator of how well the crickets perceived their rearing environment. Right? Unfortunately, we could not find a significant effect here now for our rearing density on the number of newborn neurons, right? Although you see sort of a trend here that the higher the density gets, the less neurons we get. Fortunately, these differences were not significant. Now I cannot say if this is just in our assay, maybe our sample sizes were too low, but in any ways, looking just at the number of neurons was in this case not sensitive enough to find an effect basically of the rearing density. However, what we did find here was that crickets reared at an intermediate density did better in a simple learning task. So our assay looked a little bit different, where we have the cricket here at the waiting position, and after it's released into the cage, needs to make the choice between two different odors that they were trained to. And we can see that after 4 training trials, only the crickets at the intermediate density could solve our learning task, and that these crickets at the intermediate density also did significantly better than crickets at the higher density, right? So again, then being an indicator of that brain development might have been better in crickets at these intermediate rearing densities. So just to quickly summarize this again, that crickets actually had a reduced survival rate if the densities were getting too high, even when they were not food deprived, and that they showed somehow at an intermediate density, showed some kind of a maybe positive brain development that might have then resulted in better abilities to learn olfactory stimuli, even though we could not find this back in the number of newborn neurons. Now, this is not to say that the number of newborn neurons never shows any difference, because at the same time, we also did experiments in where we provided the crickets with additional food supplements. So all crickets were always reared are always reared with the chicken feed diet, which is absolutely sufficient to rear them to adulthood. But we also gave them basically different treats consisting of carrots, oranges, or spinach. And actually, they did not like our orange treat at all, but those treats that they did like, carrots and spinach, resulted actually in in a significantly higher neurogenesis rate. So here it's a bit difficult to conclude whether this was the effect now of an environmental enrichment through this additional vegetable treats, or whether this was now a nutritional benefit. Right? But just to say that we do find in some cases an effect on brain development through the rearing conditions. Now, how would we continue with this? It would of course be nice, especially for insect rearers, if they had some clear neurobiological markers, maybe like cortisol levels in mammals, that could give a clear indication and simple indication whether animals are stressed or in a certain moment. And in crickets, actually, we do have we do have different biological states, which I already mentioned there a bit. When crickets engage in these ritual courtship fights, that this results in the loser entering a certain depression-like state, while the winner gets in a sort of stage of euphoria, which results in the loser continuously losing fights and the winner continuously winning fights. Right, so there's a really like a depression-like state, and especially in the group then of Walt Stevenson, and this has been studied in great detail. Quickly, I don't know if this works. Yes, I can very quickly show you how this looks. Right. So if crickets then engage in these fights, right, you quickly see. So this is how it looks. Normally, crickets do not get injured in these fightings. But whoever loses this fight will essentially then suffer from a sort of a permanent depression. And let me just see when yes, if we come to round 2, you will immediately see what I just mentioned, right? That essentially the cricket that lost the fight will not engage anymore in any kind of aggressive behavior, right? So this is of course a very different setting than our farming, but still we were hoping that this depression-like stage, which is mostly marked by high levels of nitric oxide, could also be used as an indicator for stressful rearing environments. And on the contrary, this winner effects is marked by high levels of octopamine. So maybe the balance of octopamine and nitric oxide could in the future be used as some kind of a neuronal marker for stressful or less stressful rearing environments. Now, with this, I just want to also summarize a little bit this part. So, although often a bit dismissed, I think growth and development assays are still very important in just assessing insect health, so to say. But these should, of course, be supplemented by further behavioral bioassays especially to get more insights into the mental stage of insects. And in our case, then learning assays might give some insights into the cognitive developments of crickets. And for the future, maybe neuromodulators like octopamine and nitric oxide could also function as potential stress markers for these insects. Now, finally, I just want to get back to my starting point a bit. How do we bring insect welfare together with insect farming? So the 5 freedoms are, of course, a very practical approach, and I think many of them, the goals of insect welfare also overlap with the goals of insect farmers in the way that, of course, also insect producers want to have healthy insects free of thirst or hunger, for example, or diseases. But at the same time, we still have a huge knowledge gap, especially on the species-specific needs of certain animals. So I think there is a challenge to actually produce welfare, to increase the welfare of of insects, is simply by the fact that we don't know what the specific needs of the species are. And actually, and in some cases, we do have to strike a balance, especially by reaching certain sustainability goals and to combining them with insect welfare targets. And finally, I just want to stress again this point that in some cases, especially researchers, but also entrepreneurs working on insect farming and researchers working on insect welfare might have different value systems, and it's very important to keep that in mind and to keep talking to each other. Now, with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. I would like to thank especially Thomas Schouten and Lindsay Fun for contributing the data, and all other members of my group for their contributions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. Excellent, excellent talk there. We do have some questions, so I will kick us off. What are some potential negative aspects of globally adopting insects for food and feed, aside from the knowledge that they can be a cost-effective source of protein with lower CO2 emissions?
So wait, aspects from the knowledge. So negative effect, right? So I think now I focused very much on the positive effects. Indeed, but I think there is, I think something that we need to be aware of when it comes to insect farming is that I think there is a risk that insects might be used in certain conditions as simply as a cheap feed for animal livestock, and that there is a risk that we run into a sort of a, let's say, a crutch for a broken livestock system, and that insect feeds are sort of used as a way to greenwash industrial conventional animal farming systems, right? So I could see that there is a risk that we, for example, insect producers run into a competition with soya feed producers to just reduce prices of animal feed, right? Where we then get into a downward spiral that insects are produced cheaper and cheaper, and soya feeds are produced cheaper and cheaper. And actually, in the end, we lose the sustainability benefits and actually just produce cheap animal feeds.
So, I mean, my sort of vaguely naive assumption here is that actually for insects to be properly sustainable in terms of like reducing the sort of CO2 production or climate impact, whichever way you want to frame it, humans will need to eat those insects directly rather than them being fed to animals, maintaining the problems of energy loss through trophic levels that we currently have. Is that a fair assumption on my part, or am I
indeed, right?
a bit pessimistic?
No, indeed, you're absolutely right. Like the greatest sustainability benefits we of course reach if we consume insects directly. But I think it's difficult at the moment, at least in many countries, to actually to see that happening. So I think the biggest growth we're mostly actually seeing in the insect or in the animal feed sector. But yeah, indeed, right? If we really want to aim for sustainability, then eating them directly will always be the better alternative.
Or eating plants also an option.
Indeed.
I've heard.
In addition.
Do you have any any sense of what changes in the brain might be mediating the improved cognitive performance of the crickets in the intermediate density condition? If it's not to do with increased neuron number, is it to do with something else?
Yeah, indeed. So I think what we did not look at, and I think so crickets are a bit special actually in the way that they have this neurogenesis throughout their life. Most insects, such as honeybees, for example, will actually manage increased learning, or their learning through increased synaptic plasticity, right? So basically the existing neurons, they grow new branches, make new connections with other neurons. So we do not get more neurons, but the existing neurons make more intense connections. And this sometimes you can measure this to increase mushroom body volume. And I would assume that this also contributed to what we saw here, so that although there was no significant effect on the number of newborn neurons, we might have had an effect on the branches that these neurons grew.
Yep.
So maybe if we would have measured mushroom body volume in addition to neuron numbers, we might have seen an additional effect.
Gotcha.
And I think in crickets, it could very well be that we're dealing with a combination of both, so that we have new neurons and these neurons also making more connections.
Yeah, this is a question that I was also thinking about asking you if nobody else if we had time. So octopamine is generally considered a stress hormone. And this is kind of like, it's going to be my question. It was basically my question was going to be, because octopamine is so ubiquitous, would that be a good candidate for a general cross species? Even though obviously you talked about the need for species specific stress or welfare indicators. Octopamine seems like it might be a good one to be like a cross species. And the question goes further. Based on the data presented from cricket flights, do you think is possible octopamine might not be a good indicator of welfare state by itself, but rather must be combined with other measures? If so, what other measures might be useful besides nitric oxide levels?
Yeah, I fully agree with you, right? That octopamine seems to be involved in everything. But indeed, I think we always need to take it if we want to find basically neuromodulators or neurotransmitters that could sort of give an indicator of the welfare state of the animal. We always need to consider a combination of different neuromodulators. So, for example, I would think that the combination of dopamine and octopamine could also be relevant in some cases. Similar, I think in some species, serotonin might also be interesting to look at. But I do have the feeling that especially biogenic amines, so octopamine, dopamine, serotonin, it could give us a good picture of basically the mental state of an
animal. I've got a question about this, the supplementary diets and the neurogenesis rate. So you didn't see, so you did see an effect there, like the spinach, right, and the carrots, they like that, and that seems to do good things for the neurogenesis rate. Are you testing whether this was enrichment or nutrition? Are you giving them color matched pieces of plastic and mashing up the food supplement and seeing if that has the same impact? Are you conducting those experiments to sort of ascertain this, or?
So I must say, unfortunately, this just finished, so we're still kind of seeing how we can puzzle this apart. I must say that at the moment, my feeling would really go in the direction, though, that this is more the effect of the environmental enrichment than of the nutrient supplement.
Okay.
Because if we see, especially our control diet, so the chicken feed, it's actually designed, of course, for chickens, but it contains basically all nutrients needed for neurogenesis or for proper development of the crickets. So we certainly do not have any limitation in the cricket nutrition. But also, unfortunately, I didn't show any pictures of this, but if you see, for example, the spinach in the rearing containers of the crickets, that definitely gives another layer of environmental enrichment to these crickets. In the way it offers additional hiding spaces, it's certainly also very aromatic, right? So it really changes the odourscape in the rearing boxes. So my guess would be that it's really this environmental enrichment.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, people, unless you're like, yeah, familiar with Lars's work, looking at, say, yeah, the bumblebees that play, the idea that insects might need enrichment, I think is a little out there for some people. I can't speak for myself, but yeah, I think that the idea that even crickets could benefit from environmental enrichment is actually really, yeah, really fascinating. We have another question about production. Is there an interest in research on novel species not currently included within food and feed? Or is there more of a potential for investigating, say, different substrates, which I think means different food substrates for existing species that are exploited?
Yeah, I think actually, well, currently I think producers, of course, they mostly looking for standardizing everything, and they're just focusing on like 4 different species. And I think in Europe and North America, this is especially also driven by the legislation, right? So in Europe, at least, we have at the moment 5 species that you're allowed to rear. So this certainly limits the number of species that are being used. But I think globally, I think there is over 2,000 species of insects that are eaten by people in different places. And I would say that the potential is, of course, huge. So I think no matter what specific aim your farming has, I think there's probably an insect species to look into that is most optimal for a certain purpose, if we can say that. But I think there is, especially I think especially for these smallholder farmer examples that I mentioned, I think there's a great potential to especially exploit more local species. So I know, for example, now on projects and farming, cricket farming in Africa, there's of course many at the moment. Still, many farmers use the house cricket that are used globally, but of course, every region has also its locally adapted cricket populations. So exploring this potential, I think, will be very important, especially for this smallholder farmer applications. Because I think to just say, okay, let's say the house cricket is the best species globally, I don't think that will be the case, right? I think no matter in which region of the world you are, there is probably an insect species that is best adapted to your rearing conditions or to your environmental conditions, and then that also has, of course, beneficial effects on the rearing of these animals.
All right, I think we'll squeeze one more question in, and then let Alex get back to, I think, spending time with his children, which is probably more important than spending time with us at the moment. Researchers often provide little enrichment for insects in their lab environments. Do you think these sort of sparse environments affect the generalizability of, say, behavioral experiments or lab results from wild insect populations, which are, in theory, from a more enriched environment?
Yeah. Yes. So I think, I mean, it is, of course, well, I think for researchers, if we want to standardize across labs, and I think every lab is basically keeping their insects in an impoverished environment, then of course it is great for making research comparable. But I'm very certain that we're not seeing the full potential of these of the insects, right? So I'm certain that if we would increase or offer environmental enrichments also in our laboratory rearings, we would certainly get a higher or see more cognitive abilities than what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah.
So I can just as a quick example for this crickets, for example, if we look at this fighting behavior, I know that from the labs that are performing these tests, if we compare wild populations in this fighting assay with the lab population. The wild populations will have fighting scores off the chart in comparison to the lab populations. So I think we're certainly underestimating or breeding our insects, if you can say that, more stupid
Yeah.
than what they want to do in the wild.
Okay. We have a question which is somebody's asking to share for your email address for a follow-up question. So I don't know if you want to speak that, direct somebody to your lab website perhaps.
Yes, indeed. Right. I can. Maybe I can.
I think you can write to everybody, and if that's okay.
Yeah, I can see if I can type that in the chat. And then... Right. So this is the.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, I would like to thank Alex once again for joining us and giving such a fascinating talk. And I encourage everyone to join us in the new year, where we have more speakers to give other fascinating seminars. So happy holidays, everybody, and yeah, see you very, very soon.
Right. Thanks for hosting, and everybody for listening.